And again, let me welcome you to July the 20th, 2021, our specialty crop virtual lunch series. Today we're going to be looking at pollination and bees to get those specialty crops started, so that we'll have something to reach the market. Again, this project that we've been working on in the center last couple of years is developing some crop profiles for specialty crop producers to use. It has been a part of the specialty crop block grant program through the Tennessee Department of Agriculture, and Debbie Ball is in charge of that particular program. Don't know if Debbie's with us today. She may not be able to be on. She's going to try to catch some of the other meetings as we go through our particular series. Today for our meeting, we're certainly glad to have with us Dr. Jennifer Tsuruda. She's an assistant professor in entomology and plant pathology with us at UT. She has been here for just a few years, and she has been extremely busy ever since she got here, working with the bees, the bee educational program through the University of Tennessee. We were able to grab her today, and we're certainly glad for that. Glad she allowed us to have a little time with her today. And I'm going to turn it to Jennifer in just a moment or two, but certainly glad to have her with us today. If you have some questions as we go along, I just invite you maybe to put those in the chat box if you don't mind. We'll look at those at the end, or if you want to save it and voice that at the end, that will be fine as well. So Jennifer, I've made you a co-host, so you should be able to share your presentation with us, and we'll get your section underway. Again, thank you, and we welcome you, and thank you for being here today.
Fantastic. Thank you for the invitation. Does it look okay on your end, Troy?
Yes, I've got it. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, just making sure. You never know with Zoom these days. I
understand.
So I'll turn my video on just for a second and say hi and thank you for the invitation to present in this series. I am working from home today, so my internet's a little bit sketchy, so I'm going to turn my video off while I present though. But thank you for the invitation. This is a great opportunity. I think oftentimes we get stuck in our little bubbles, and when we talk about pollinators and bees, sometimes I'm inundated with working with beekeepers, but it's really important to think about the importance of pollination to agriculture as an agroecosystem and the services that pollinators provide. So as Troy mentioned, I do focus mainly on honeybees, but I am interested in other types of pollinators. So we'll get into some of this as well. And I guess one of the highlights or one of the common themes you'll see throughout this is the importance of diversity of bees for many of these specialty crops. Okay. So when we talk about the value of pollinators, and I apologize if you've heard this already, but I think it never hurts to hear it again. The value of pollinators on our diets, our day-to-day lives, oftentimes doesn't seem very evident. And so when we actually look at a picture of what our breakfast would look like with and without pollinators, you can see here on the left-hand side what would be a nice balanced breakfast, and on the right-hand side is what your breakfast would look like without pollinators. So of course you're missing those fruits, as well as your jam and your fruit juice, and then even some of those tree nuts that are in the granola. So things like almonds are really important in terms of having insect pollinators. But you can also see that the coffee creamer is missing. And so I always joke with people that it's, I ask, do you think the bees are actually pollinating cows, and how that would probably tickle the cows and they wouldn't like it. It wouldn't be a good situation. But this is actually one of the indirect benefit of pollinators, in that they are pollinating the forage for livestock. So, if you're not a breakfast person, if you like burgers, you can imagine that. What in your lunch or your dinner would be missing if you're not into so much the fruits and vegetables. So it's been estimated that about 1 out of every 3 bites of food that we consume has benefited through animal pollination. So again, there are different types of pollinators that we'll get into, but the animal pollinators are really contributing a lot towards these healthy, balanced diets that we aim for. And the value of the crops in the United States that result from insect pollination is estimated to be over $29 billion. And of that, honeybees are doing about 2/3 of that pollination. And it does vary from year to year, because of course, with all types of agriculture, there are environmental factors, and it's a very dynamic system. So these numbers are not the same from year to year, but we tend to see this similar trend of honeybees doing at least half of the pollination services of these crops. So really important. And then also the benefit of honeybees too is that they are honeybees. So we haven't added, in Tennessee specifically, we haven't added $2 million in revenue from honey production. So that's a nice bonus of working with honeybees. And we talk about pollination, this is just basic biology review for most of you, I'm sure, but we're talking about moving pollen grains from the anther, the male parts of the flowers, to the stigma, the female parts of the flower. And so there are different types of pollination, of course. And so in a simple situation, you would have a complete flower that could self-pollinate. In this case, just by some agitation or wind, it was able to self-pollinate itself and get enough pollen grains in there to produce a normal looking fruit, or what we consider normal. So that's one of the main things about pollination, is the adequate amount of pollen that gets moved to not only produce the correct shape and size of the fruits that we desire, but also the yields that we desire. So how many fruits and how good are those fruits? So in this is that I was just showing you the case of self-pollination, but now I'm going to show you the case of cross-pollination. So you have pollen from one flower moving to the stigma of another flower. So from male to female, different flowers. And this happens for a lot of our specialty crops, where we have different male and female flowers on different, even on the same plant as well as on different plants. In some plants, you will have sexed plants where you'll have one that's male and one that's female. So of course you need a pollinator or something to move that pollen from one plant to another. And one thing I'll point out too is why we talk about this diversity of pollinators, or you hear about native bees and honeybees and all these other types of pollinators that exist. It's because we have so many food crops that we're growing that are not necessarily native to our region. So you can see North America, we do have some food crops that originate here that are awesome food crops, but it would be a very limited diet if we were only growing those food crops. So we are relying upon pollinators that can pollinate some of these other crops that are non-native to us. And that is one reason why honeybees are such great pollinators for our agricultural systems, is because they are generalists who do well with many of these types of crops. So when we think about pollinators, especially bees, we think about some of the kind of big obvious ones, especially in the region we're in. We have a lot of squash or cucurbits being grown. We also have some berries and apples, as well as blueberries and strawberries being grown. So of course, in this sense, we're thinking about the fruits of the plants that are being produced with this pollination service. So the bees are moving the pollen and they're fertilizing that ovary, which then develops into a fruit, which is what we tend to consume. But we also want to think about the value of these pollinators in the sense of seed production, and also things like oil and even fiber production. So here's a nice poster from the Pollinator Partnership showing the importance of these various pollinators to different types of plants that then produce seed. But it's also not just the production of the seed for future planting, but here I'm showing some canola. It's a really important, we really need these pollinators to produce that seed, which then we crush to get oil production. So sometimes it's not just the seeds themselves in terms of future generations of plantings, but the products, the resources that the seeds then provide. So lots of benefits there beyond just the fruit production. So I'm skipping around a little bit, but I want to go back to those different types of pollinators. There's another beautiful poster from the Pollinator Partnership showing the diversity of pollinators across the world. And I wish we had all of these here in the United States. We don't. And one thing that this poster doesn't depict, though, is the importance of wind pollination. And so for many of our crops, especially out in West Tennessee, we have a lot of row crops that are wind pollinated. So many of our grains are pollinated by the wind. Although I will point out that even some of the wind pollinated plants are still visited by insect pollinators. So in that case, we still have to be careful about how we manage those lands and exposure to pesticides in terms of how pollinators may still be coming into the region, even if they are not necessarily pollinating those crops for us. But when we think about pollinators, we oftentimes are thinking about different types of animals that are doing the pollination. And then in this case, we're talking a lot about birds, bats, insects. Insects are the big ones. And so here's just a collage of many different types of insects. You can see there are some bees in here, as well as some wasps, but also some unexpected characters. So these bottom two are actually flies. And this is one of those flowers that is like a carrion flower, so it smells like rotting flesh that the flies are attracted to. And then also beetles can be effective pollinators as well. In this case, they're feeding on the flower resources, but they're also using the flowers as aggregation sites for mating. Here you can see all of these are paired up. And in doing so, they're moving pollen around, and that makes them effective pollinators. But really specifically, we're going to be talking mostly about bees and honeybees in terms of pollination services for many of these specialty crops. Not because they're the most important or anything like that, but there's also been a lot of research done in these two subject areas. So we have a lot of data to pull from there. When we talk about the importance of bees, one of the reasons is that they collect pollen all over their bodies, and they are actively collecting pollen. It's not just something that accidentally ends up on their body that gets moved around as they're moving from flower to flower for nectar resources. Here you can see a honeybee that's collecting, has this nice big pollen load that it's mixed with nectar, so it looks like a nice putty ball or like Play-Doh. And then we have here we have a carpenter bee that's getting stamped by this passion flower. It's a perfect fit there, so she's getting access to that pollen. And then once this flower realizes it's lost some of that pollen to a pollinator already, then the stigmas start to droop down. So the next pollinator that comes in will then transfer its pollen from another flower onto the stigma and then result in a fruit. We also have a lot of native bees that are collecting pollen all over their body. So in this case, they're collecting it all over their legs, but this one has some on their femur. And then we have certain types of bees that have these rigid hairs on the undersides of their bellies called scopa or scopy. And that's, as they walk over these flower heads, they collect a lot of pollen grains that way. So you can imagine how easy it would be for pollen to move from one flower to another, just as they're walking over these flower heads, collecting nectar. And so I mentioned a little bit about these different types of plants and flowers and why it's so important to have these pollinators. And so just going back to some of that basic biology is thinking about whether or not the plant system that you're working with. And so it's hard to, we always want to generalize, but when you're talking about specialty crops, there is a lot of diversity there, especially in the types of pollination services they need. And so you have to ask yourself, what is the plant system like? Do they have individual plants with male or female flowers, or do they have both female and male flowers on the same plant? And will selfing be enough for this crop, or does it benefit from cross-pollination? So in many crops, even though they could self, you get a better fruit, or you get more yields or higher yields if you have cross-pollination. And then some, of course, can't. They may have male and female flower parts on the same plant, but they don't self very well. So you have to have multiple cultivars being grown with pollen moving between those cultivars. So yeah, just want to point out too, we have these perfect and imperfect flowers too, just some terminology that will come up as you start looking into the crops that you're looking for pollination services for. And of course, the further these male and female parts and flowers are, the more important it is to have a pollinator vehicle to move the pollen from the male parts to the female parts. Oh, sorry, this picture it fell out of view, but here is actually a pumpkin or squash, and it shows basically the different morphology of a male and female flower, and how the nectar is actually down below on the female flower, so that when it's actually lower on the male flower as well. So when the bee travels down into that flower head, she has to cross the anther and collects pollen as she's collecting the nectar. And then when she goes and collects nectar out of the female flowers, her hairy body then brushes against the stigma and then results in fertilization of that female flower. So we do have many different types of bee pollinators. I just wanted to go over a few because I don't want to just focus on honeybees, but I will mention some benefits of honeybees in just a second. But I just want to point out we do have a lot of different types of native bees out and about. We have mining bees, we have cellophane bees, we have many types of sweat bees, as many of you are probably experiencing these days and cursing at them as they sting you because they're collecting your sweat and you don't realize they're there, and you squat down or do something and then you end up getting stung. A common one that we hear a lot about these days are mason bees. They are of the family Megachilidae, and so they actually are one of the types that has those rigid hairs on the undersides of their abdomens. And then we also have Apidae, which is a really huge family of bees that has that includes honeybees, bumblebees, carpenter bees, squash bees, even the southeastern blueberry bees. So a lot of the big pollinators that we use for managed pollination, as well as just natural wild pollination services. And while we manage honeybees and bumblebees in either like small boxes or large wooden boxes, for a lot of these other types of native bees, most of them are actually solitary bees, and they're nesting oftentimes in stems or in the ground. And so I think that's one thing to think about is when you're managing your land, no matter what you're growing, is whether or not you're dependent or benefiting through ground nesting bees, and then thinking about how you treat your soil and thinking about tillage, but also thinking about drench treatments where you're affecting the soil where these bees are reproducing. So just thinking about those considerations for management. And then nectar is the main carbohydrate source for many of these insects. So many different types of sugars. There are some sugars that are toxic, but I just want to point out here just some differences in terms of how different types of pollinators collect nectar. And so here we're going to watch a moth collecting from floral clocks, which are flowers, ornamental flowers that open around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And one thing you can see about this moth, if you look closely, is that she has a really long tongue, or what we call a proboscis. So she's not really making any contact with this flower. So she's collecting nectar out, but she's obviously not transferring any type of pollen because she's not coming into contact with the flower. In contrast, when we look at bees, here we see a honeybee working on a composite flower head. I think this either might be a zinnia, I can't remember, but you can see she has a short tongue, and this composite flower head has many of these really small flowers that make up what looks like the center of the flower to us. But as she's probing to get that nectar, her whole body is basically getting pushed against that flower or those many little flowers and picking up little grains of pollen. So you may be able to see some of those grains of pollen on her, and then moving that pollen from individual flowers within that composite flower head. So that's one of the ways that bees are really efficient pollinators, is relatively short tongues that end up making the bees have, or allowing the bees to have closer contact with those flower heads. The other thing too is that these bees are collecting protein, pollen, from the flowers as or collecting pollen as a protein resource, but also they're getting these lipids, amino acids, minerals, and sterols from the pollen as well. And so they're actively going after the pollen. Again, it's not like a moth that might accidentally pick up some pollen as it's foraging for nectar. It still can happen with bees, but they are also actively collecting pollen as a protein resource, which they use to make brood food or a liquid feed that then they give to their developing larvae. Honeybees in particular have really interesting specialized structures that allow for pollen collection, specialized pollen collection. So on their hind legs, they actually have parts or a part that we call the pollen basket, which is this indentation that has really rigid hair, a few rigid hairs on it, that then the pollen, once they mix it with nectar and make that putty, will stick onto rather easily. They also have this rake and a press here on that leg, which is, you can see it here, but it's blown up here on the right. And that allows them to run their legs over their bodies and collect all of those stray grains of pollen from all over their hairy bodies, and then press it down into that nice pollen ball that they have on their leg. And then down on the bottom right, you can see actually, this is a close-up of their hairs. It's a little bit hard to see, but what you can notice is that it looks really different from these hairs and spines on the legs. They are not simple hairs, they're actually branched hairs. And so thinking about things like pollen, that's obviously a great way for pollen to get stuck on the bee, is by getting entangled in these branch hairs. So that's another way that the bees are just pollen magnets and great pollinators. One thing too I want to point out for many of our crops is that we actually use a lot of honeybees in terms of migratory beekeeping. So this is a map from the USDA showing some of the common migratory beekeeping routes across the United States. So many of the commercial beekeepers will mainly use their colonies for pollination services, and they'll drive across the US. You may have seen a couple of these semi trucks, or you'll hear in the news oftentimes when they do turnover on freeways and it's a giant mess. But this because we're moving these bees out to do specific crop pollination. As you can see, there's a lot that's being done out in California. One of the big ones is crops is almonds. But there's also different routes beekeepers may take. They may just go out and do one crop. They may do 4 or 5 crops, oftentimes giving a break in between. But oftentimes this is because people always ask, well, why can't they just stay in one place? Why not just leave all those colonies in one location? So the timing is part of it, but the other part too is the number of hives that are needed for these pollination services is often very high and not sustainable long term in those areas, because after that crop is done blooming, there's not enough forage to support those all those bee colonies, but also there's just not space for all of those bee colonies. So for things like almonds, we use about 2 million honeybee colonies. And if you've ever been to California, you know that there's not space for 2 million honeybee colonies out there. It's a pretty dense community out there. So oftentimes we'll have beekeepers in more of the areas. Actually, the Dakotas have large numbers of beehives in the United States. And so many of their beehives are moving across the US and especially going to California for almond pollination. But just something to keep in mind that we have certain crops that grow really well in certain areas. And because we don't always have all of the bees in those areas, we move honeybee colonies around. That's another benefit, again, of honeybees, is that we can move them around. And we do this because they're as valuable as native bees and wild bees are, there are not enough of them to do a lot of this commercial pollination across the US. And in certain regions, like in Pennsylvania, there's for apple pollination, many of the farmers out there do have enough wild pollinators that they're starting to decrease the number of honeybee colonies that they rent. But then in other states like Michigan, they are still definitely renting out honeybee colonies for apple pollination. So it depends upon what's available or what your natural landscape is like in terms of the population of native bees and wild bees that are available. The other things too about thinking specifically about honeybees and how honeybees use different types of plantings, they are really good about being we call it floral fidelity. So on each foraging trip, they tend to only stay on one species of plant, which makes them really efficient pollinators. If you have a bee that's going from a cranberry plant to an almond plant and then to a squash plant, the pollen movement there is not going to benefit those plants. They need to be moving pollen from within one plant species to get effective fertilization and pollination. So I'm just showing you this picture here because I have maybe 2 pictures where I have honeybees that have mixed pollen loads. And so that's one way you can tell that they're actually foraging on different things. And this picture I took in like mid-January of one year. So there just wasn't a lot of forage available. So that's probably why she was collecting off of 2 different sources here. You can see a dark color on the outside and more of like a yellowish bullseye, whereas typically you see pollen loads like you see on this bee here on the right, where it's very homogeneous. And if you look at those pollen grains under a microscope, you can see that they are very, very much from one species of plant. And here's another one, again, from a time of the year where there's not a lot of forage available, where there's mixing of 2 types of pollen. But that's just, again, one of the benefits of honeybees is that they have that floral fidelity. So per trip on one flight out, they tend to stick with one species of plant, but then they can vary each trip. They could go to and visit a different plant species. So that's how they are generalists in a way, but also good in terms of having that floral fidelity and staying within a species. I just mentioned almonds before, but they allow for a good example when we talk about pollination of a lot of our fruit crops, and a lot of the specialty crops are these fruit crops that need cross-pollination or benefit from cross-pollination. So in this case, when we talk about almonds, you have a pollinizer and then a row, and then you also have a row that gets pollinated. And so you need the bees to move basically pollen across these rows. And so that's why they're planted in this way. And we are using the bees to move that pollen across the rows. They bees are very efficient, so they tend to like to go down one row. And this is one reason we oftentimes are using honeybees, is that we can saturate these fields and use many, many honeybees out there and get more of the bees moving from plant to plant. And we'll talk about some of that movement in just a little bit. But I wanted to give you an example too about talking about apples. I know that's one of the specialty crops that Troy mentioned you all are working on. And I've done a little bit of apple pollination. It's just for consumption. I know you guys are talking about, or there's been talk about cider apples, but pretty similar in terms of needing the types of pollination services through bees. And again, apples, there's a lot of diversity there, and the types of pollinators, especially bee pollinators, that can be used. But honeybees are oftentimes rented by growers to get the pollination services done for this timely manner. And it tends to be an early crop. So this is one reason why we tend to work with a lot of commercial beekeepers on this, or beekeepers who have hives available for pollination and not just relying on feral bees that are out there, is we want to ensure that we get enough pollinators early on in the season, where the numbers of pollinators tend to increase throughout the spring. So if we're talking about needing pollination in March or early April, the numbers are not as abundant as in May and June. So, I did a little bit of apple pollination in South Carolina, and so I was excited. I saw the pollen the bees were bringing in, and I was showing that to the farm manager, and I thought, oh, that's not the picture he wants to see, right? Because that's my bees taking the pollen away. I like to see that because I'd like to show that my bees are foraging, but I think the more effective thing is to show him that fruits were being produced, that they were actually moving pollen around and not just taking it all back to the hive. So in this case, we had a lot of pollination of the fruits, and this is where one of the crops where it becomes a little bit not tricky, but you have to consider the effectiveness of the pollinators and what your natural pollination or wild pollination populations are like, because you can end up with over production or over pollination, which then you'll have to thin, which is not a terrible thing, but it is something that it will provide. You'll need to have some extra work, and so your thinning can be done either manually. So at the university farm, we have a lot of interns that we can use, but also you can use chemical thinning as well. So it is a way that you can ensure that you get enough pollination and then decrease the number down to what you want, as opposed to just hoping you have enough pollinators to get that optimal level of pollination. So we overshoot and then thin down. And so just showing how later on we did thin down, and you can see in the background here, we're using a vertical system for the apple orchard here in this farm. And then, oops, sorry, that came off the screen a little bit. But one of the other things too that's tricky is that when we're working on specialty crops and on farms that have multiple crops, is thinking about the relative attractiveness of certain crops. So those apples are overlapping in bloom time with blackberries, and we had those growing at the farm too. And when the blackberries were blooming, the bees were flying right past the apples to go to the blackberries. So that's something that has to be taken into consideration. And they didn't, one year they overlapped almost completely, and that was a little bit troublesome for the apple pollination, but then I just put more colonies out there. But in another year where we didn't have as much overlap in terms of the blackberry bloom and the apple bloom, we were fine with what we had initially stocked the yard with. And stocking rates depend a lot upon the type of crop that you're working on, and then cultivars, but as well thinking about the different systems that you're working on. So if you're working on, say you're doing watermelon pollination, one thing to think about is whether or not you're doing seeded or seedless. Seedless, you have to basically double your stocking rate because you have so much inert pollen that's out there in the field. So again, these stocking rates, they vary also by region and depending upon what type of native pollinators you have or wild pollinators you have in the area. But typically we're talking anywhere between 1/2 to 5 honeybee colonies or hives per acre. Usually it's 1 to 2 per acre, but it does depend on those crops. So I wanted to touch on some of these other topics that Troy mentioned were being worked on in the specialty crops sessions. And so cut flowers, this is another soft spot, or I don't know, sweet spot in my heart, because I have a little side project going on at the organic farm where they have a CSA, which we call the VSA because we're UT Bulls, and trying to find flowers that are going to be easy for them to use in bouquets, but also that will help feed my, and there's not necessarily crop forage available. Obviously, one of the main ones that we think about, especially when we think farms and CSAs and cut flowers, are sunflowers. This is Lemon Queen. We really like this one. It tends to grow, it grows relatively easily. It doesn't grow too tall. It does branch. So you end up with multiple flower heads per plant. The bees love it. I don't know. I just think it's a really nice one, easy to grow, doesn't flop over too much as long as you're able to give it enough irrigation when you're starting out with, or when you're establishing them so they can grow nice thick stems. So I'm fortunate that in some areas of the farm, we are able to irrigate our plantings, but in many of the locations where I do have plantings, I do not have irrigation. And so I am relying on natural rainfall or lugging water out in jugs, which doesn't always happen as often as it should. But so just also just showing one of these plots out behind the farm where I do not have irrigation other than what I haul out there or rainfall that comes out. And so you can see this is a relatively late planting, but again, just trying to plant some different varieties of flowers that we want to see whether or not they make good cut flowers for the VSA, looking at their bloom time, also looking at the visitation of pollinators. And so over time, you can see even though I did start relatively late, the sunflowers came up and it did do pretty well out there. There's some sunflower, actually on the very far end, there's sunflowers as well as Mexican sunflowers, and I have some zinnias, more sunflowers, some celosia and some sacred basil. There's some calendula and then more sunflowers on the right hand side. And so you'll see, oops, sorry, I forgot that I had mentioned that. You'll see that over time it does change and I'll move things out. So like I took out the sunflowers, once those were done blooming, I then subsequently put in some flowers that do better with some cool season growing for the fall. And so it does look a little more worn out later on in the season, but you know, to even have forage available for the bees in October is actually really important. So they oftentimes have a lot of feed mid to late spring and early summer, but we really are encouraging plantings that will produce good adequate nectar and pollen early on in the season and early spring, as well as late in the fall. Those are times when we don't have a lot, even actually late summer and early fall, we don't have a lot of forage available for the bees. And so if we want to really keep their population strong, we like to make sure that they have enough food that they're putting on. And one thing I'll point out too is when we think about the attractiveness of some of these plants, because I mentioned that is one factor that we're measuring in testing out some of these plants, is that it's important to look across the season because attraction is relative. So early on in the season, this is the sacred basil, the honeybees were not going to it. And it was likely because I had other things growing out on the other part of the farm, like I had some cover crops growing. So they were out in that area, but then as those dried up, and then in October, there wasn't much alternative forage for them, then I started seeing them forage on the sacred basil. So the importance of some of these cut flower crops depend on when they're actually blooming. And so that's something to keep in mind too. And it's not only for the flowers themselves, because oftentimes the cut flowers are oftentimes you want to pick them right before their peak so that your customers will have the most beautiful stage. But one thing that we're trying to do in our program is, you know, maybe the flowers aren't in the best condition, but we use it as an educational tool to say, oh, you know, forgive us if these flowers look a little less than ideal, but we've been feeding bees with them. And so that this is actually helping with our production of our pollinators, and then also giving them a jar of honey in their CSA later on in the season, so that they understand the value of those bees in terms of pollination, but also honey production. So it works out well. And then we also give them some seed from these plants at the end of the season. That's the result of these pollinators. And we also try to manage, and it depends upon the plant species. This has become a little bit more difficult in thinking about, because it varies by species, what percentage of the plot or the planting do we leave for the bees completely that we don't even pick from, and then what do we harvest for the cut flowers so that it's more aesthetically pleasing in terms of those bouquets. So definitely a lot to consider there, and these are really small plots, but we have multiple small plots that serve as replicates. And the other thing too, in terms of looking at attractiveness of plants, is not only the different species, but also looking at the density and diversity and distance of those plots from, especially when we're talking about honeybees, from their hives. So even if it's a lower quality nectar or lower concentration of sugar in that nectar, if they have 5-acre field of something that's a little bit lower quality versus a small strip of something that's higher nectar concentration, they may prefer the large field that has plentiful nectar, because overall that will result in a higher gain for them. So there's all types of foraging efficiency that happens with bees. Oh, and so I just want to point out too, because I know zinnias are a really popular cut flower, and so they're also great for pollinators. And so here's just a short video. So it does attract many types of pollinators, as you can see here. I was somewhat happy to see this hummingbird come through every day, but not super thrilled to see her come through and suck out the nectar from every single flower that was out in the field, leaving not much for my bees out there. So zinnias, yes, they can be beneficial, and they are great for many types of pollinators, but probably not producing or resulting in a lot of nectar left for my bees. But I think they're also really just interesting flowers too, where you can see many different types of pollinators on them. Uh-oh. Hang on one second, technical difficulties. We'll get there. All right. That's just to see if you guys are all still awake. So
nice
yes,
job.
we have.
Nice job, Jennifer.
Thanks, Troy. That'll be a test. At what minute did Jennifer's program crash? So I think that's one of the interesting things though about these plots, is that you can see that there's a lot of different types of flower structures. There's lots of different flower colors. I do really like the Mexican sunflower to start. So I started all of these from seed. And to have such a nice bloom even after, within one season, I'm always impressed by that. And then even with some of these, the annuals that I've planted out there, there's so much pollinator visitation that I ended up having a lot of seed production. So I have so many Mexican sunflower seeds right now. There's not any way I have enough space to plant them all. So that is kind of one nice thing, is if you can get into a seed sharing program or give away seeds as part of your CSA, it's a nice benefit. But here you can see too that there's a lot of pollinator diversity on these sunflowers. Didn't see a lot of my honeybees, but again, not a large patch of these obviously, and they did have other forages that they could go and visit. Cosmos are out in one of my other fields too. Again, not the most attractive for the honeybees, but a lot of other types of pollinators out there, including monarchs. So always looking for ways to support some of our more endangered and insects that we're worried about in terms of conservation of populations. I was really happy to see that in the cut flower guide that you all had goldenrod, because I think goldenrod gets a bad rap from people where they think it's causing their allergy issues, and it is not, but it just kind of has that look that people get worried about in terms of allergies. But this is such an important see, it's great that you guys are calling it a cut flower or rather than a weed, because it is a late season bloomer, and it actually does produce a decent amount of nectar for the bees to forage upon. And so this is one of the great plants that I wish people would plant more of out in their yards. And there are many different varieties that have different structures to the plants. And so you can find some that look a little bit more manicured rather than, like wild prairie. But a lot of people like the wild prairie look, especially out on farm and natural areas. So really, really great plant that I encourage more people to plant. And then also just showing one of the plots that I have, it's not all nice and manicured and nice individually planted uh, plugs that I've transferred or transplanted out there. It's a very different approach in terms of just wildflowers scattered seed. And then, it just takes a little bit more in time in terms of harvesting flowers and going out and not having any guarantee in terms of the number proportion of different flowers, but and trampling around through the plot to collect those flowers, but obviously a lot less effort in terms of the planting time and the work that went into preparing that other plot and individually putting in those plants. So just another option. And even if they aren't used for cut flowers, like the poppies don't make great cut flowers, they wilt really quickly, but they do provide pollen for bees earlier on in the day. So it still will attract and feed some of those pollinators. So not everything in the plot has to be just for the pollinator or just for the cut flowers, but it can attract pollinators to those cut flowers in those fields as well. This is one that's not on the list, but I think it's a really cool one that I want more people to plant just because it's an interesting plant in terms of conservation. This is Rattlesnake Master, but it's also, I think it makes an interesting addition to cut flower bouquets. I guess my vision of a cut flower bouquet is not necessarily the standard, like what you would see at the grocery store. It's either a little bit more natural or it's more conservation, odd looking plants. But I just wanted to point out that you can see here, there's so much insect diversity just on this small area of this Rattlesnake Master. And it is more of a succulent growing plant. It's rather odd looking, but there are other varieties that are, or similar species, related species that have some really cool purplish blue color inflorescences too. So really neat one. And then another thing that we're doing out of the farm too is I'm planting a lot of cover crops for the bees. And so one of the main ones is buckwheat, and this actually serves as a nice filler. So when I see this, I always just think like, this is just so much better than like baby's breath in a cut flower arrangement. So especially if you're going for a more rustic farm bouquet with sunflowers and more of these kind of non-traditional ornamental flowers, the buckwheat can be a nice addition to that. And this is a great nectar resource for bees, as well as providing pollen. And there's some interesting research on the phytochemicals that are in the pollen and nectar that actually benefit the bees in terms of health therapeutics. And so I just want to touch on herbs for a little bit too, since that was one of the areas or one of the other topic areas. And so I just want to point out, I really love rosemary. It's not a huge producer. Like you can get some beekeepers that will actually use large plantings of rosemaries for varietal honey. But one of the benefits of them is that they're blooming early on. So I took this picture in mid-March at the UT Gardens. And so there's not a lot blooming mid-March available for the honeybees that are out there. So just something to consider is having some early herbs as well as some later season herbs too. Here's some oregano that was out at the UT Gardens as well. And so you could obviously do this in a larger setting. And I know people are probably thinking, but if you let it go to flower, that you don't have these nice tender leaves for harvesting. And so I think that's just something to think about in terms of how you plant herbs. And so I do herbs for multiple reasons, not just for the bees, but also in terms of the culinary purposes, as well as being able to have kind of a diversified use in terms of like for catnip. I have 2 cats. I like that I can produce something that feeds my bees as well as entertains my cats. But then also, there are some herbs that have medicinal purposes as well. And so these I just think are fantastic in terms of having multiple functions, as well as, those culinary purposes. It's just amazing to have these easy to grow plants that come back either by reseeding as annuals or as perennials, and they're packed with flavor. They have a long shelf life because you can dry them as well. So it's not like, you harvest it and it's only good for a week after that. There are ways to keep it around and use it for later times of the season. So I absolutely love herbs. I think they're a great resource for bees. This is sacred basil. This is not like the typical common basil that we're talking about in terms of consumption. I just didn't have a cute video or picture of regular basil, but just showing how basil can be so beneficial for these many different types of bees. There's a lot of diversity out there with different bee species, as well as some wasps out there, and even some flies that can visit these really small flowers for pollen as well as nectar. And this one, I was just impressed by how long these plants bloom. So from about end of July, early August through mid-October, there were blooms, and it came back this year too. I've been a little slacking this season, but many of these plants came back and were reseeded. Borage is also a great herb that can be planted for pollinators as well. Beautiful flowers. I've had a little bit of difficulty in terms of being able to grow it in certain areas because I have a lot of pressure from wildlife, not bee wildlife, but things like deer that will come and chew it down, but also a great herb for bees. And then one of my favorites is mountain mint. So I just want to talk about mints in general, but this is a pycnanthemum. It's not the regular type of mint that we're talking about, but just showing how mints in general are so great for pollinators. And of course, here we're looking at a lot of native pollinators, but just a really great resource. They can spread a little bit like crazy, so you have to be a little bit careful there, but really, really awesome plant for pollinator. And then catnip. So I mentioned before, I really love catnip, not only because it's easy to grow, but because you can harvest so much from one of these plants. And here you can see a wasp and a native bee or a wild bee visiting these flowers too. Many really small flowers, but many of them. And so again, you get a long bloom time and readily produces seed. And you can end up with many plants before you know it. You can also do cuttings if you're looking to kind of get ahead and do successional plantings. That's one really cool advantage of these herbs, is that you can get multiple batches going and blooms throughout the season. And so I mentioned a lot about different diversity. We talked about diversity of herbs, but also diversity of bees. And so I just want to touch on this as we're finishing up here, is just mentioning how the diversity of pollinators, especially bees, it's been shown by research, can affect yields in many of these crops. So it's been shown, this is one of the first studies looking at, or early studies looking at, not oftentimes we talk about competition between different types of bees, but when we talk about in agricultural settings, you can actually have bee interactions be positive in terms of the yields or the production of plants. So in this case, they looked at honeybee pollination of sunflowers, and when they add bumblebees into the system, the honeybees ended up being more efficient pollinators. One of the reasons that they think that might be is because the interactions between the bumblebees and the honeybees led to the honeybees moving from flower to flower more often and crossing those lines to do that cross-pollination. So you can think of it as the honeybees are kind of getting chased away by the bumblebees, and that results in them making contact with more flowers as well as different flowers, so making that the hybrid cross there. And then there's also some really great research on many of the fruit crops. And so I'm using blueberries as an example, but it's been shown in many different plant systems or crop systems, including things like cherries, that really, when you have, even apples, I should point out too, when you have diverse pollinators that vary in either their numbers, their population size, as well as how efficient they are when they work a flower, how many of those pollen grains they move, in terms of the activity pattern, how far do they go? One benefit of honeybees is that they can travel far, but that's not always great if you have some other neighbor that's planting something that's more attractive, then they may not pollinate your field. But some of those native bees don't forage far enough in terms of you being able to get effective pollination in a large commercial setting. Visitation rate, some of them will make more visits in a given amount of time than others. And then again, those species interactions. So what's been shown for blueberries, as well as some of these other crop systems, fruit crop systems, is that when you have multiple types of bees in the orchards, you end up with higher yields as well as higher quality fruits. And so we see this many times, that we have an abundance of bees that all contribute in different ways. So diversity in bees is a positive thing. And I just wanted to also point out, because we do get some concern from folks who don't necessarily want to put in some additional wildflower strips to help support the pollinators, because they're afraid, again, that it might deter them from the crops themselves. But this will actually, it's been shown in by this study to actually keep the bees around. And because the bees are healthier because they have diverse forage available, meaning that they have diverse pollens and diverse amino acids that they need to consume. Those populations are healthier and their numbers flourish, and that can lead to increased pollination visits. And then also there's some nice work being shown in some of these farmers adapting their systems and thinking about not only having these wildflower strips there to help the pollinators, to help pollination, but then also as a nice diversified market plan in terms of producing seed, or as we've been talking about before, cut flowers. So last thing I want to mention is the importance of thinking about how we manage these lands, depending on what type of specialty crop you're growing. There's probably going to be some type of insect or pathogen pest that you're thinking about having to control. And so, of course, pollinators and pesticides don't mesh very well. And so I wanted to point out that there's this University of California IPM bee precaution pesticides rating website. And the URL is really long, so I always just tell people to Google University of California IPM bee precaution ratings. And you're able to look up different pesticides and look in terms of how the mode of action, how it affects bees, whether or not it's going to affect, or it's been shown to affect other bee species besides honeybees, and whether or not it affects honeybee brood. So a really great resource, but also keep in mind that these chemicals in their list are relative to California. So not everything in that list is registered for use in Tennessee and vice versa. But I think it's a really great resource to go to. And one of the things that you might find interesting is when you look through these, the database, you'll see that it's not just insecticides that pose risk to bees. There are also risks of things like herbicides and fungicides. So we need to exercise as much caution as we can in terms of the exposure risk to our valuable pollinators. So it's a hard balance, but we really encourage people to think about IPM and IPPM, so integrated pest and pollinator management. So trying to control your pests as well as promote your pollinators. And so with that, I think I ran a little bit long. I'm sorry, Troy, but I want to thank you all for your time and for your dedication to agriculture and learning more about how pollinators affect these systems.
No, it's fine. Thank you for your time. I do not see anything in the chat box right now, but does anybody unmute and have a question or two for Jennifer? We'll certainly let you do that right now. Anyone?
Is anyone growing crops that need pollination by insect pollinators? Do I need to like have my computer go crazy again? Well, I guess the other thing, since no one is talking, the other thing I'll point out that I didn't mention in the presentation that could be of value for you all to think about too is if you are dealing with a grower, or if you are a grower who is looking to rent bees for pollination services, the importance of a pollination contract. And I know people don't, it seems really like official and legal, but that's to your advantage in terms of both sides being able to express their expectations and needs, so there aren't misunderstandings and assumptions that go unmet. And so this is a chance for both sides to express what their needs are, essentially, to make sure it fits the services. We don't want what could be a great partnership to turn into something detrimental. So.
Right. Thank you, Jennifer, and for that information and for that last slide that you had up there as well about the precaution, the pesticide rating thing. I think that would be important as well for a lot of folks that we need to pay attention to. And I've heard a couple of presentations by Jennifer, maybe at the Big Tennessee Conference a year or so ago, maybe 2 years ago now. But it's just amazing after watching this also, just what is out there, what these bees, the other pollinators can do for these crops, and how important they are to the field of agriculture. And we appreciate the comment or two that's in the chat box as well. That this has been very helpful. And Jennifer, thank you again for that. Just quickly, and I don't want to hold anybody over, and as we go through this series, we'll give some more attention maybe to some of the profiles themselves that we have created, but and Jennifer alluded to a couple of those in her presentation. In part of this project, we're making some crop profiles for specialty crop producers, and we're working with the Center for Crop Diversification with the University of Kentucky. We have 2 or 3 of those on our website right now. And let me see, I'll just do this quickly. Maybe let me just share something here quickly. If you see, hopefully our center's website here, it's just cpa.tennessee.edu, or just Google Center for Profitable Agriculture. This is our landing page or our home page here. But if you just go to program areas, and then you'll see the program areas that we have in our center. But just quickly, here's the one on specialty crop profiles that we're working on. And just to go to this, the crop profiles that we have right now. We have the cut flower production in Tennessee is one that Jennifer alluded to. This one's on our website. It is being printed right now. We have the culinary herb production in Tennessee as well, and the garden mum production in Tennessee. That this is the one we'll be looking at on the 28th with Lucas Holman. Some other specialty crop profiles that we did put on our website. These were just kind of 20 that we put together after surveying some agents about what did they see as maybe important crops in Tennessee on specialty crops. These crop profiles hook directly to the University of Kentucky and their site, so they are helping us to develop some for Tennessee. We use some of their materials. They use some of our materials from the center as well. And then if you want a direct link to this Kentucky Center for Crop Diversification, you can get that from our website as well. And I just want to show you very, very quickly something here. This takes you to their homepage. They have lots of things on here that I think will be a benefit to you. We hope to have other things on our website for specialty crop producers also. But if you just go to production and click that, and if you go to crop specific, they have hundreds of these crop profiles that we're kind of working on. But vegetables or fruits, whatever it might be, and just click on, there's a list of the vegetables that they have. Let me just click on the one for watermelons, and you go down to the very bottom and you'll see the watermelon profile, the crop profile, and you just kind of see these are how all of these are laid out. So this is what ours will be looking like. A little bit of introduction, a little bit on marketing, and then it gets into production a little bit in selection and maybe some pest control, site selection, those kind of things. Harvest and post-harvest things are in here as well. And then at the very end, it always ends up with some of the economic considerations. So seeing those have been very helpful for us, and hopefully that you can use some of those as well. We'll continue to refer to those as we go through our series here, and hopefully you can make some use of some of those from our website as well. But due to time, just wanted to keep you about an hour. Jennifer, thank you for your presentation. Very good for us, and a lot of good information in there. Again, appreciate the comments that are in the chat as well. We'll get this posted maybe after this series. I'll let you know where these will be posted so that you can view them if need be. And again, thank you. If you've got others, we'll be back tomorrow at the same time looking on marketing of specialty crops. And if you've got other friends, neighbors, whoever, or other extension agents as well, you can still sign up and view the rest of these that we'll be having over the this week and next week as well. But if nothing else, we'll just say thank you for being here. Jennifer, thank you again, and we'll visit with everyone pretty soon.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thanks so much.
Troy, one
Yes.
Minor suggestion: when you talk
Yes.
about sharing resources with Kentucky, you can always say that you guys are cross-pollinating program. Nerd it up with pollinators wherever you can.
we may come up with, we may
use
that tomorrow.
You'd be surprised how many times I use that in grant proposals when we're talking about sharing resources. Because I mean, there are things to think about, right? Because both programs, you end up with a synergism, so you end up with a better product in the end, ideally. It never ends with me, Troy.
I knew John Goddard would say something before it's
you threw something up there really quick and you jumped off of it before I could screenshot it. But before you did the producer diversification UK page, the page right before that, it had a bunch of things listed down through there.
Was on you. I was on UK's.
No, it was one before this.
This one.
So the one on your website,
Maybe in your website.
Oh, was it on ours? I'm sorry.
Yeah, where you had the other specialty crop profiles, maybe.
Well,
yeah, you had things like watermelon, rutabaga.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's on Kentucky's. I'm sorry.
No, click on other specialty crop profiles.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, yes.
Yeah.
I got
and
you.
I think it links to Kentucky's, right?
Yes, these still link to Kentucky's. Yes, these are some agents helped us put together to say, hey, here's our 20 we think that would be good for Tennessee producers. But they all go back to the Kentucky side. Yeah, John, I got you.
Click on sweet corn there. I get that same pub.
Yes, sir. You'll get this goes right to them. And to get the profile itself, you just have to go to the bottom. It's usually like here it'd be sweet corn profile, and you'll get that same kind of a deal. Most of these are 5 or 6 pages long, something like that.
You realize how valuable that is, right, Troy?
I have recently.
You've not
yes,
forgotten
sir.
all you learned in extension.
I need to learn so much. It's
There's
pitiful.
a lot of good stuff right there, buddy.
Yes, sir. I've come to realize that. Well, thank you, sir. I will pass that along as well.
We don't need that green book anymore.
No, man. I know. Hey, I know you're old when you start saying the green book and the red book, and I know you're old, brother.
I can send those to Moorhead now, right?
Yeah, he was even on here today, and he didn't even say anything.
But there he is.
Still on, FYI. Be careful.
Oh goodness, who's still on here? We better be careful.
Moorhead.
That's exactly right.
Moorhead, what are you doing? Right.
I got enough sense to keep my mouth shut.
Hey, this may turn into the meeting after the meeting, even when you're live. You know how long those go.
I thought Larry Moorhead retired.
I thought he did too. I thought, hey, what was that line you used on Eileen up there at that meeting that day? Said Moorhead, he was talking to Eileen Legault, and he told her thought that she was Larry Moorhead's 4-H agent years ago.
Well, that got her, didn't it?
Yeah, that was funny. Oh, that was funny.
If I had Goddard's money, I would have done been gone.
Oh man, Jennifer, you hear anything worthwhile in here? You jump right in, but you may not hear anything worthwhile.
Oh, I'm collecting information. I'm kidding. You all are entertaining. But yeah, Troy, I was just gonna say, I know everything's super busy right now, but as far as that, the Pick Tennessee training, just let me know, since we didn't have much time to discuss this one.